All right, so one of my favorite parts of the book, The Successful Thinker, was the scene about brain ants. And what happens in the scene is Cynthia comes into the pharmacy and sees Otis waiting on a really interesting character. This character's name is Steve, and Steve is tall and muscular, and he's got tattoos and chains and black leather jacket and a big mohawk. But Otis is talking to Steve as if they were best of the best friends, and they're getting along really, really well. And this is really fascinating because Steve is purposely written in the book as the kind of guy that would just scare the daylights out of Cynthia if she happened to be on the other side of the counter. So Otis finishes waiting on Steve and he goes over and one of his co-workers, Marcia, says, "Hey, how come you're always so nice to Mohawk guy?" Obviously showing some pretty big disapproval of Mohawk guy. And we really wanted to do a couple of things. We really wanted to draw out the idea that, hey, you know what? We walk around in society making judgments about other people based on their appearance. And then we come to find out that most people aren't what they seem to be. And the other thing is that we talked a lot about in this section brain ants. Otis tells Marcia, "Hey, look, a few years back, I was struggling. I had a tough time getting my thoughts, really on that positive, optimistic, outgoing vibe that I always wanted to keep them at. And I realized that I had developed brain ants." Now, ANTS stands for automatic negative thoughts. And ants was a term that I first heard from Dr. Daniel Amen, who is a renowned brain specialist who has studied brains and who is really famous for taking scans of brains and figuring out, what makes a brain healthy and what makes a brain unhealthy. And it turns out that there's really two factors to a healthy brain. Number one is making your brain healthy in the same way that you make your other organs healthy. In other words, all the things that would make your heart healthy would make your brain healthy. And the big thing is to really understand that your negative thoughts are created by essentially your negative thoughts about other people, other events, things that are going on. What happens is our brain becomes habituated to a certain way of being and a certain way of thinking. So if we make it a habit to think negative thoughts, talk negative talk, then what we find is that our brain begins to think negatively about ourselves and our situation and our circumstances. So Otis goes on to tell Marcia that, hey, look, I've got a 5 step plan for avoiding these ants. Ever since I have implemented that plan, I have become someone who is positive all the time. I'm happy all the time. And what ends up happening is the results that emanate from that positivity are absolutely mind boggling. So, what is the 5 step plan that Otis uses? Step number one is he refuses to value judge others. And what that means is that when you go ahead and criticize another person for the way they look, the way they act, the way they think, the things they believe in, what happens is that our own brain goes ahead and says, look, we must be the kind of person who judges people. So then it says, well, then it must be okay to judge ourselves. And when we do that, we're always a harsher judge on ourselves than other people would be on us. In other words, we tend to overinflate our mistakes and our failures, and consequently, we tend to repeat those because our brain doesn't really know the truth. Our brain only knows what it believes to be true. So if you make a decision to only value other people and never value judge other people, our brain gets in the habit of saying, hey, we look at other people in a positive light, so therefore we must look at ourselves in a positive light. Isn't that fascinating? So then number two is, hey, I write in a thought journal. Otis is really bright and he has learned something that most people never learn, and that's that thoughts are just things. You are not your thoughts. Your thoughts are just an electrical impulse created by your brain, and your job is really just to be aware of your thoughts and not necessarily follow those thoughts. Dr. Daniel Amen said something that I thought was really interesting. He said, every single person that walks this planet has some thoughts that no one else should ever hear. That's natural. That's normal. And the thing that you want to realize is that you want to follow the thoughts that are productive, the thoughts that are helpful, and you just want to let the other thoughts burn out and die. And a great way, a really great way to recognize what you're thinking and your patterns of thought is just to write them out in a journal and write them out quickly and say, okay, this is what they are, and then crumple the piece of paper and throw them away. It's really important to recognize that you are not your thoughts. You are just someone who is basically walking around aware. And the more aware you become of what you're thinking and why you're thinking it, the easier it becomes to control your thoughts. You see, I used to believe that my brain had a mind of its own. And then after I read Think and Grow Rich, I realized our brain does what we train it to do. And therefore, one of the things that I do is install a reminder. Otis talked about in the book is he puts a rubber band on his wrist, and when he finds himself going down a negative thought pathway, he snaps that rubber band, and that sort of shocks him back into, hey, I want to keep on my anti-ant program. The next thing that Otis does is he's very, very consistent in feeding his brain positive information. You know, it's so easy to get hung up in the drama and the negativity and the news media's version of the world we live in. The reality is, yes, there's violence. Yes, there's political strife. But in all reality, most people are basically good if that's what you go looking for. The world has always been an amazing place, an okay place, or a horrible place, depending on what you're looking for. So when you're feeding your brain, you want to feed your brain positive energy, positive books, positive CDs, and positive experiences. Again, your brain is really just a monitor. So what your brain says is, we must be the kind of person who thinks positively because we're always looking for positive information. If you can do that, if you can do that one step, just go out and say, you know what am I putting into my brain? Am I focused on the news? Am I focused on positive quote books? Depending, you will find that your world changes drastically based on what you feed your brain. Number 5 is Otis says you can choose an or you can think model. And I found this fascinating. So Otis could think of Steve as the Mohawk guy, or he could think, I admire Steve because he's got the courage to go ahead and dress like someone that really expresses his true inner being. It's a funny thing. A lot of times people will look at someone like Steve and say freak or weirdo, but don't you really wonder just how courageous you must be to step out in a unique look like that? I think it's fascinating, and I think a lot of people forget that. So what I want you to do going forward is I want you to think about how can I practice, practice, practice using these 5 steps to your anti-ant program and really put those ants to rest for good. All right, I'm going to look forward to seeing you in the next video. Don't forget to download the exercise and have a wonderful time figuring out how to erase the ants from your brain. Thanks a lot, my friend. We'll see you in the next video.